wife that would go like this. How can a loving God allow this to happen? Following the 9/11 tragedies in New York, Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania, I heard a famous evangelist make a statement over TV. He said something like this: many people have asked me why God allows such tragedies to occur. And he said, frankly, I do not know. It's along this line that I have some thoughts to present for your consideration. Let us start with the story of creation, Genesis 1:28, where God said, let us make man in our image. Now, I'm not going to discuss how God made man. I believe that God created everything that's been created, and that he created man, and he made him in his image. Now, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? I think it must mean that God gave man some abilities and characteristics similar to his own. Let's say, for example, he gave man a brain capable of thinking, remembering, planning, and creating. He also created man with freedom of choice. He's totally free as God is free. He can do anything he wants to do. If he wants to drink and get drunk and get in his car and drive down the interstate, go to sleep and cross the median strip and hit a car and kill somebody, the perfectly innocent person, God doesn't intervene. Now God created man with a conscience, able to tell right from wrong, able to love and to hate, to be compassionate or not to be compassionate, and all the rest of the virtues you can think of. In addition, he created man to be able to develop his own character, his own personality. Now, if God hadn't given man freedom of choice, he would be sort of like a puppet on strings, or a pre-programmed robot. He'd be a human being doing God's will, saying what God wanted him to say, and as such, he wouldn't need a conscience. He wouldn't know anything about love or hate, and he wouldn't be able to develop his own character and his own personality in total freedom, as God is in freedom. Well, now, God placed this man on this earth. He's subject to everything that's on the earth. He's subject to nature and what all nature produces. He's subject to the tornadoes, the earthquakes, the floods, and all the rest of the violence of nature. But he's also subject to the gentle rains and the sunshine and all the beauty of the earth. He's subject to the weeds that grow in the fields and in the gardens, the thorns and the briars and the poisonous plants, as well as all the good plants and trees. He's subject to all the living creatures that live on the earth, from the large animals down to the mice and the rodents and the insects and the germs and viruses and all the diseases that occur. But he's also subject to the evil that exists in the world. Man first made the mistake of using his freedom of choice in the Garden of Eden. And later, when Cain slew Abel, Genesis 4:8. And sin, evil has spread. Now man is subject to all this environment. And he has been equipped by God to have freedom of choice and do whatever he wants. And as he uses this freedom and reacts with the environment, he develops his own character and personality. Now, we we must stop right here and remember that God is all powerful, He's in control, and He can do anything He wants to do. He can interfere with our choices, but He rarely does. He can protect us from accidents, but He rarely does. He hasn't promised to heal our sickness, but He can. He hasn't promised to prevent us from having an accident, but He can. And these things we often call miracles. Things that happen that we can't explain ourselves. And know God is there. He's already demonstrated that He can quiet the wind, and He can quiet the waves, and He can feed the 5,000, and He can heal the sick and raise the dead. And He does it today, in rare cases when it fits His ultimate will. His will for a person or for a people. But these are rare indeed, and we often call them miracles, and they no doubt are. Now, we think back to this, when I mentioned the man that drank and got drunk, God was not with him. That's freedom of choice. It's also the case when the pilots flew their planes into the trade towers and the Pentagon. Freedom of choice. Now, when I was thinking about these things, I remembered a little book that our pastor Rick Johnson called our attention to some years ago. It's called The Will of God. And I got it out and I found it was written in 1944 by a pastor in London, England, during World War II. And it consists of 3 sermons that he preached to his congregation. And in the first sermon, which is the first chapter, he said that 10 days before he wrote that sermon, his son was killed in a German air raid over London. Now he said we might say about that tragedy that was God's will. But he said, I don't think so. I think it was Hitler's will. Hitler's one that sent the planes, had them drop the bombs, kill as many people and do as much damage as possible. And God never had anything to do with it. I say freedom of choice. And I think if we use the will of God to explain a tragedy of that kind, we're blaming God for things He's never done. He never uses evil to punish anyone or kill anyone. Not since Christ died upon the cross. Now, I want to leave you one little side thought. Once I had a very devout Christian lady say she never wore a seatbelt because she counted on God to protect her. I say we don't have that choice. And I base this upon the account of in the New Testament when Christ went into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. While he was there, the devil took him on the pinnacle of the temple. And among the things he said to Christ, now cast yourself down, for it is written, He will send His angels to protect you, lest you cast your foot against a stone. Christ answered quickly, it is also written that thou shalt not tempt the Lord your God. I think if it is a safety measure, we're obliged to abide by it. And not ask God to protect us when we can protect ourselves. Beyond that, we can ask for His help and guidance. Now those are some of my thoughts. I'd like to summarize by saying that I believe that God does not interfere with our freedom of thought, our freedom of choice, even though it ends in a tragedy. And I don't believe He shields us from the violence of nature, tornadoes, floods, earthquakes, or whatever. Because if He did these things, we wouldn't be free. We wouldn't be the free being that God has created us to be, so that we can develop our character and personality in freedom as God is free. Now, we must remember that God is standing by. He's ready to give us help, to give us the wisdom and the knowledge and the understanding and the inner strength to handle whatever problems come our way. As Christ once said, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." Now, if we look at that door, we see that there's no latch string on the outside of the door. If that door is mine, the only way it can ever be opened is by me. If that door is yours, it can never be opened unless you open it. Pastor Ellis, thank you very much.
Thank you. And God's people said,
Amen.
I would suggest that if you have received something of what I have received by having this preacher preach to us today, a share of the wisdom, and you think, wow, I would like to hear more from Dwight, you tell him until his conscience gets to him and he has to come back again. And because this was just one visit that I got this, that he just shared with you. And so I know there's a whole lot more that he could share. And so I want you to come back. And I think these people want you to come back and do this again, don't you?
When we finished up the parsonage, I often thought I'd like to sit in this chair and have a cup of coffee and a donut at the breakfast bar. But I didn't know I was going to have to sing for my donut.